Nobody knows them better than they know themselves. And so when you're missing the voice from the most important stakeholder, you're really missing out. And so that's why that was something that has just taught me, like, yeah, we have to find ways to hear directly from kids.
We know from the student surveys that are more quantitative, the percentages of students that feel engaged, the percentage of students that feel like they belong. But the thing that we felt like we were missing was more of their words. What is it like for you? What do you want? What are the barriers? So that way we can more effectively problem solve and take the right next steps within our classrooms.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach.
Today we're delighted to welcome Bethany and Saleem Blevins. Bethany has been an educator and leader for more than 25 years and is currently a director of student services. She believes that when schools are inclusive, teachers empowered, and systems aligned, every student has the opportunity to thrive. Bethany will soon take on the role of elementary principal at American School of Asuncion.
Meanwhile, Saleem is a lifelong educator and middle school principal, also in Asuncion, and brings genuine enthusiasm for creating a culture where students are challenged, engaged, and inspired, both in the classroom and beyond.
So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen. Let's just jump right into this. Can you talk a little bit about how each of you use data in your role and where you see its strengths and where does it start to fall short?
Sure, I can start. So I'm the Director of Student Services here. I work with the counseling team, learning support, as well as our advanced learning program, which is our gifted and talented program. I would say some of my main uses of data are using data to determine who needs what. So who are the students who might need more support, like intervention? Who are students who might need more advanced work, more enrichment? And then using data from there to see if what we're doing to provide services is working. So there's the academic data that we use very frequently, especially within the different groups that I work with. And then another piece of data that I use frequently is teacher feedback data. So in my role, I work with grade level teams, help lead professional development, work with different groups across elementary, middle, and high school. And in each of our meetings after a professional development session, we ask for feedback to both make sure what we're providing is relevant, it's meeting needs, and we know what teachers are walking away with and what they're excited to try next. So that way we can follow up. Definitely my goal with professional development is that it's a consistent conversation and theme throughout. So really getting feedback from teachers along the way is, similar to how we look for progress with students. I'm looking to see, is what we're delivering supporting teachers, and how can their feedback help determine what the next steps are?
You're talking about using data to understand need and impact. Is that a fair summary of what you were saying there?
Definitely. Yeah, for both students and for the adults in the building.
And what about Saleem, from your point of view?
So as a middle school principal, we use data for a variety of different reasons. I think one of them is really to just understand the trends that are going on our campus and hopefully to react in positive ways to them. So one of the things that we're always looking at as my leadership team is we're looking at things like attendance data, data on tardies, conduct, and that sort of data, just to make sure that kids are where they're supposed to be, and that we're responding when kids aren't, that we're finding out where our issues are, where the snags are, and that we're responding appropriately. And then we have next the student learning data. And so we collect a variety of different data in the classroom and then do regular testing. We use map testing here at the school as well. And we sit down as a leadership team here and really look at that and identify where we might have some problem areas that need addressed and how we get attention to those areas. So we look at data as groups of grade level teams. We look as leadership team. And then we create plans together in order to try and impact that data, like I said, in positive ways. We are also regularly collecting and getting better at collecting community data, collecting data from our parents on how things are going. So we recently had parent-teacher conferences, and we had some issues around the signups and timings, and did everybody have enough time to get what they needed out of the conference? And so we collect feedback regularly from events like that. How did it go for you? How can we continue to make this better for the future? And we've had a lot of positive response from that sort of data collection. And then I think for me, the most important part, the important key component that we've added to our data collection this year is regular student collection of data. How are students feeling about their school experience? How are they feeling about their classes? And so we've got a counselor survey that we run at the beginning of the year. And then we have coming up right now, we've got a reflection on every single one of their classes. And they're giving us information on classroom environment, on instructional delivery, on assessment strategies, and really working to collect information on how kids are experiencing school, and then using that data to sit down with teachers and talk about what's going well and what might we want to address.
I mean, that's a lot of data, right? And I think lots of leaders and educators will recognize that same kind of challenge and opportunity in their schools. That's a lot of data. Where does it fall short, though? I mean, you've talked really comprehensively about all the different places you look and all the different ways that data enriches your understanding of the challenge and the impact of your response. Where does data fall short in your roles and in your school, do you think? Where is it not enough?
I would say for me in my work, sometimes the data that we're currently collecting doesn't capture the nuances of like small bits of progress. So for example, if we're looking at, a progress monitoring assessment every 2 weeks on a certain type of spelling pattern or phonics pattern, it may not capture what the teacher is noticing. So I think the observational data is a way that across the schools that I've been at, we haven't found a great system yet for how to collect that data and value it as much as other data points. Oftentimes in my debrief with teachers, they're able to shed light on really what's going on for the student, what their strengths are, what their barriers are, what works to help them make progress in a way that, when we're looking at benchmark data, progress monitoring data, it's not the same. So I'd still love to find a solution for how to have more concrete systems for catching the teacher observational data and putting as much value on it as well.
Because I guess those numbers that you're talking about, they're clarifying in many ways, right? But they're also reductive in some ways. And how do you protect that nuance? Saleem, from your point of view, how do we keep that nuance, the richness of that nuance in the data in a school?
Yeah, I think sometimes we try and reduce data to numbers because they're easier to manipulate, they're easier to respond to. And for me, it's really about collecting the qualitative data in addition to the quantitative data. I think that helps tell a better story. It takes longer for sure. Interpreting it is often challenging, but taking the time to really hear from students, from teachers, from parents in their own voice about their experience, and then trying to make sense of that data helps to get to some of the nuance or some of the, I don't know, sometimes you collect data and it's just confusing. Like, why? This isn't what I expected at all. Why are we saying this? And when you get to hear directly from the voice, like I said, of your stakeholders, it's a lot easier than to make sense and then to adapt to or to make adjustments based on the data that you get.
I have a question about data culture. And when you're thinking about like how to build data culture within a school, a lot of schools start off with the places where they're already collecting data. You mentioned things like map tests and student surveys and things like that. But oftentimes those tools that schools are already using aren't necessarily in full alignment with what they value. Imagine you were walking into a school where there was a lower level of data culture. And when you talk about data, people just assume you're talking about map testing, for example. That's what they're familiar with. How do you go about broadening and deepening that understanding of data so that you leverage what's there, but you also show that there's more than that?
One thing that I've done before is really try to connect whatever data we're collecting, especially where maybe people are hesitant or worried about more formal, like assessments like MAP. They have a negative connotation with collecting data and are kind of scared of it. I try to connect whatever data we're collecting to the values and what's important to them. So one example is at a past school, I met with grade level teams. We were talking about family satisfaction and making sure our families were happy with the school and that they wanted to continue on with us. And teachers were actually the ones who brainstormed the questions that they wanted to ask parents about how the connection and the bond was between teacher and family. So because they had the opportunity to really say, like, here are my goals, here's my aspirations, here's why I'm doing these different strategies for parent connection, and craft the questions, I felt like that built buy-in for what data we were collecting because it was questions they wanted answers to. They wanted to know if what they were doing was working. And they had ownership over it. They were able to really craft those questions. So it wasn't somebody else coming in and saying, here's how we're measuring you. Here's how we're evaluating you. We're going to tell you if you're a good teacher or not. It was their opportunity to get information that was important to them. And then they really drove the action planning once we got the data in. So I think starting with data collections where staff can have some ownership over what it looks like and it connects to aspects of your school programming that are really important to them is one step you can take to show it's not this like huge data set that's going to crush you. It's information that can be helpful for you in your practice.
And if you're talking about agency and ownership there, Bethany, is that something that could also apply to students? To what extent do you enable students to own their data? Because we're talking a bit about power here, aren't we? If I see data as something that's done to me as a teacher,
Right.
then the power isn't with me, the agency
Right.
isn't with me. But what about the student perspective? If data and assessment are things that are done to me, again, I'm going to have that fear, that anxiety, that cynicism, skepticism.
Yeah, one of our learning support teachers here, I think, does an incredible job of really giving students more agency over their goals. So she works with students in the learning support program. They have individualized goals. They're in middle school. And one thing she does is she meets with each student at the beginning of the year, debriefs what they want to work on, what they've gotten feedback that they should work on from others as well. And then they help to craft their goals and they actually help to create Google Forms that they get feedback from their teachers on. So for example, if one student is really focusing on task initiation, and they know it's really hard for them to do in science class because maybe they're more intimidated by the content, they say, I want to get feedback from my science teacher and I want to ask the question of, do I start within the first 5 minutes? Do I ask my friends for help? Do I then ask the teacher for help? So I think it's a really amazing way that she does it. She's able to help guide them, the students, in the conversation. So she does provide a lot of scaffolding. And at the end of it, the students are the ones who get to determine who they're getting feedback from and on what, which for me has made it a really powerful process.
Saleem, anything to add to that?
Yeah, my answer is like completely opposite of hers, and I'm listening to her answer. I was like, oh, I like that. That's a great one. Yeah, she's talking about sort of starting with the stakeholder that's involved with the data, and my answer initially to that question was sort of the opposite. For me, it's always been about the leadership team and their approach to data and how they feel about data. At a previous school, we were, looking at data, diving into data sets, having conversations, and it became really apparent really quickly that people had vastly different experiences with collecting data, with interpreting data, with understanding data, comfort levels with data, developing questions to help us guide our search for what was important to us as a community. And so we needed to take a step back and just do some learning about data collection together. And so we found the DataWise program, and as a leadership team really stepped into that and did trainings together, learned about collecting data, learned about reading and interpreting data, learned about staying low on the ladder of inference and really waiting to make those assumptions about what this means. And that was really, really helpful for us and just sort of aligning our approach to, yes, we have a data set What are we going to do with it? Or what kind of meaning can we make of this? And so for me, it was really making sure that my leadership team was comfortable with data so that they could go out and work with others in a way that wasn't high stress. Beth was sort of describing teachers' experience with it and feeling stressed out, and this data is being used to judge me. And that's definitely a feeling that our teachers have had. But when you have a leadership team that is really asking open-ended questions and including the students, the teachers, the parents in the process of collecting data and really aligning our steps that we're going to take based on the data to our goals, to our mission, to our vision, that really helps everybody feel more comfortable with the idea of collecting data as a way to reflect on how we're doing.
I think that alignment between a school's guiding statements and how they measure stuff is often missing. But where you have that alignment between the who we are and what we measure, I think that can restore lots of this trust that can be kind of eroded in the traditional ways that we use data, I reckon. I was going to come back to you, Beth, briefly. You were talking about that brilliant example of a child being given that agency in their learning and in their approaches to learning through the ways in which they could ask for data about them. And I really loved listening to that. I found it a really nourishing idea. I wonder, though, and maybe you haven't seen this in your schools, but oftentimes student support ends up being treated as something separate from the rest of the school, and approaches that are taken in student support are sometimes not taken more broadly with the rest of the student cohort. They're kind of separate from that core work. And I wonder, in what ways can data end up reinforcing that silo? And in what ways can data actually break down that silo so we have holism across the school?
Right. It's interesting. I feel like this is a conversation coming up a lot across our middle school and high school in particular. And elementary, I don't know. I feel like right now we have more of a view of like, okay, what do students need? What can we apply? Like a little bit more flexibility with strategies. In middle school and high school, within our student support team, we've talked a lot about executive functioning and study habits and how to support students with goal setting and initiation. And at the same time, we've been having very similar conversations with content teachers in middle school and high school. We're still pretty early into it, and Saleem can definitely talk about it more. But we are talking about really how to use learning support teachers have been doing these strategies for a long time. This is really their area of expertise. So how to leverage their knowledge to really inform the advisory program and help support strategies for all students. So one example of this is we're talking now about how can we potentially re-envision what the 9th grade onboarding looks like. We found that the transition from 8th grade to 9th grade, a lot of students need those skills of organization, time management. So how can we leverage what we've learned about students who may struggle with it more so than other students, but how can we use that knowledge to help all of our students? So it's something we're still newer in, but definitely a conversation that we're having. And I would say there's a lot of openness to it. Of kind of joining forces to make sure that we're providing strategies for all of our students that would be helpful to them.
Yeah. When Beth talks about sort of the difference between elementary and secondary, I think it's often common that or at least it was in the past, where elementary teachers are really thinking about the whole child. They see them the whole day. They get a sense of them in different subject areas. They get the sense of who they are as a person. And as you move into a more departmental model like we have in middle school and high school, and teachers have so many more kids, it's a lot easier to think about my subject. And these are the standards that I need to teach, and these kids are getting it, and these kids are not. What is my responsibility as the teacher is to teach the content and make sure that I'm doing that well. And in many cases in the past, it's always been like, if the kid's not getting it, they need to get outside support. They need to get tutoring. They need to get help outside. And one of the ways that we're trying to shift that is really looking at what is our data telling us about the needs of our students. And when I talk about data, I'm talking about what kind of conversations we're having in the teacher lounge about where our kids are struggling. And like Beth was saying, executive functioning is one of them. So if I have teachers who are complaining that kids are not organized, that they're not able to take appropriate notes, that they're showing up to class late, those kinds of things, then we need to sit down and figure out exactly the scope of this issue and what we as teachers can both do to support and expect students to have in place, and how do we structure our middle school environment in order to help kids with that. And so when we heard all of those things from teachers last year, our leadership team, which is a group of administrators, counselors, teachers at the school, developed this plan of like, we're going to focus as a community on executive functioning skills at the start of this year. And we use our staff meetings as a time to come back and reflect. Okay, we all said we were going to start our class with a posted agenda that has the learning objectives, that we're going to end our classes with exit tickets. And we're going to come together and reflect on how it's going in your class, how it's going in my class, what kind of progress we're making, what are we seeing in our kids. That's the kind of data that felt most important to us, even though it wasn't something that came out of some sort of formal data collection process. And we're seeing progress. We're not where we want to be yet, but we've seen a lot of progress already because we were able to identify a problem together and align ourselves on an implementation strategy to help support students. And I guess the original question was like, sometimes this ends up as a learning support issue or a student support issue. But like Beth is saying, oftentimes we have these experts in learning support and student support who've been doing this stuff for years. And we're seeing needs far beyond just students who have been identified, and how can they help to facilitate learning for our teachers in those areas. And so we've had our learning support teacher that she's been talking about really be the guide, either in whole group sessions or going and sitting with teachers in planning sessions and helping to implement in classrooms. And that's been a huge step forward for us as a learning community.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
Saleem and Bethany, when you're talking about executive functioning and thinking about the sort of the barriers within the student's environment rather than the students as sort of the problem themselves, it reminds me a lot of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. And I was just listening to a podcast from CAST about that yesterday, about executive functioning in UDL. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the role of data as it relates to that approach as well. You know, oftentimes when we think of UDL, we think of, you know, before we reach the students, like we're doing all of this design work before we even encounter the students. But what you're describing is a different way of using data to sort of inform the UDL style approach that you're taking to the overall program. Could you dig into that a little bit?
Sure. One other example that comes to mind that I think gets at barriers within the environment is right now we're getting more information from our high school students. Basically, the questions that we put out to them are, you know, what are strategies that teachers use that help motivate you to engage in your classwork? What are barriers to your learning in the classroom? And one of the early findings so far, we're not all the way done with data collection, but one of the early findings is that a lot of students are just saying like outside noise in the classroom. So like other student groups talking, really parts of their environment that are making it more difficult for them to focus. And that honestly was a viewpoint that we weren't expecting to get. We thought like, oh, it'll be computers, it'll be friends, it'll be something else, something social. But students are the ones, and these are 9th through 12th graders, bringing up the environmental factors. So we're about to analyze that data together next Wednesday at our high school staff meeting, so that teachers have a chance to get the data and really student voices in their hands, and we can brainstorm together. Really, I think the way the conversation will end up going is more in the direction of how can we set up our classrooms, what can we do within the environment to make our learning environments more conducive for our students based on what they're telling us. So that's one example. Again, it's like getting the student feedback first and then using that to then adjust versus planning from the very beginning. But I do think it's pretty responsive and very informative. We've made a goal this year to really bring in more student voice. We know from the student surveys that are more quantitative, the percentages of students that feel engaged, the percentage of students that feel like they belong. But the thing that we felt like we were missing was more of their words. What is it like for you? What do you want? What are the barriers? So that way we can more effectively problem solve and take the right next steps within our classrooms. So that's one way that I'm thinking about it right now.
It seems to me that this is a paradigm shift that kids have been crying out for, certainly since I was a child at school, right? In school, if outcomes weren't as we all wanted, then there was something wrong with the child, as you were suggesting there, Saleem, right? And therefore the child needed to be fixed or changed or cured or whatever. Whereas writers like the British writer Paul Dix, who wrote When the Adults Change, Everything Changes. We're now finally moving to an understanding that oftentimes it's the system, right? It's the curriculum, it's the instructional strategies, it's the culture and climate of the school, it's the approaches to behaviour on a policy and practice level, etc. So if data can help that systemic shift, and as Paul said, if we can use UDL strategies to preempt rather than always react and respond to, then we're really getting somewhere, aren't we? But I had a follow-up question to something you were saying earlier, which ties in with all of this. I said, then we're really getting somewhere, by which we mean impact. But I wanted to unpick and dig into that paradigm a little bit if we can. We often expect the data to show us whether the strategies we are using have had the desired impact, right? We use data to tell us that we need to do something differently. We do something differently, and then we want the data to show us whether or not it's worked. But when can that be a challenge? Because if we want to measure impact quickly, but impact often happens slowly. If we want to measure impact in a very narrow and standardized way, but impact happens in as many ways as there are students in our school, how do we kind of marry those two different forces?
I was fortunate to do some work with the Marzano group when we were working back in the States. And this really interesting piece that they talked about, and I'd never heard it talked about before, is really looking at what they call leading indicators and then lagging indicators. And this is the way that I've sort of framed this. Yes, if we're making some changes, as we are right now, to our math program, at some point down the road, we are going to expect for our math scores to go up, and they need to go up. It's an area of focus for us. It's been a problem for a number of years, and we need to have more success. And we're making a lot of major and minor changes to our program that we are not going to see the impact of for quite some time, and it's really going to be hard to sort of measure the totality of the change in a short amount of time. And so what we need to do is we need to look for those leading indicators that are going to tell us what is going on right now, and are they giving us some indications that we're headed in the right direction. So maybe MAP scores and PSAT scores will be those lagging indicators that a year from now, 2 years from now, will let us know. But we can also measure those leading indicators on a regular basis. Am I talking to kids on a regular basis about what their experience is in school? How are they experiencing math this year compared to last year? When they get stuck, do they have strategies for doing that? Talking to the teachers about formative assessment work that's going on in the classrooms when they're looking at kids over the course of this unit. How are the kids picking up those skills that we know that they're going to need in order to be successful in the subject over time? And so when we're looking at and breaking sort of these bigger data chunks down into smaller ones that I can measure or get feedback on a regular basis by talking to teachers, by talking to students, by looking at formative, low-stakes assessment results, and those are pointing in the right direction, then I don't know for sure that we're going to have that systematic change or that big shift to the lagging indicators or the more summative data, but I have a pretty good indication that it will. And I think we can also celebrate those little pieces as well. And that's really important for teachers. It's really important for our students to know that, yeah, we've made some changes. And look at these results that we've seen so far. So I think just being really clear about what those leading indicators are going to be with teachers, because they are going to struggle. If they are feeling that everything on this change of new curriculum is dependent on how the kids do at the end of the year, that's going to be a stressful year for them. But if we're saying, no, we're going to check in on a regular basis to see how things are going, we're expecting for kids to have more success in these areas. And if they're not, we're going to work together and figure out why and what we might be able to do about it. It's a lot less pressure on them. And just like we don't want everything to always feel summative for kids, like everything is dependent on your final test score, that takes away from the learning process. And so as we step into a new program, as we step into a new system, a new way of doing things, we need to have those formative assessment or those leading indicators for teachers, for students, for parents to be able to say, hey, this is what we're expecting to see, and really be able to celebrate to the things that are going well and respond to the things that aren't going as we had planned.
I love that. Here's a question for the two of you. Both of you have been in leadership roles in several different international schools for a number of years now. And I imagine your understanding and approach to data has grown significantly over that time. When you think back to where you were when you first came into a leadership role, what advice would you give to your past self? Like if you could, send a letter back in time to Bethany and Saleem from when you were just got your first leadership position, as like, here's some things to focus on or to watch out for, what would you say?
I think I would say take it slowly. In my first leadership role with data, I dove right in very intensively with our team. We were all about academic data. We monitored it very closely. And I would say take it slowly. Take the time to meet with teachers. Saleem talked about earlier, people have really different experiences with data. Some have a lot, some have a little, some have very negative connotations, some love it. And really taking the time to get to know your team and where are they on that continuum? What are their strengths? What do they value? And making sure that they feel that teachers and whoever's looking at the data together feels supported in doing every step of the process. So what are we collecting? Making sense out of it? What does this mean to us? What other questions do we have? And then what are our next steps and how are we knowing if it's working? Just slow down, take it step by step, make sure that people feel supported. It can take a while to shift mindsets for people who are scared of data and feel reluctant to use it frequently. Oftentimes there's a lot of reasons and stories behind that, those emotions. So I think people feeling supported in that process helps them feel like they're a part of a team working together towards a goal. That takes time.
Well, that idea of it taking time speaks directly to what Saleem was just saying about leading and lagging indicators, right? Mm-hmm. What would be some of the leading and lagging indicators in your mind in working with a team as they're building data culture?
One that pops out right away is what questions are people asking when they first start looking at a sample of data. For me, a sign that we're earlier on in the process is people feeling strong emotions or finding other reasons for why the data might be the way it is. That's not based on areas that we can control. So I would want to see that shift from this isn't us, this is outside factors. I'm not sure I trust this data to, I'm curious about this data. I have these questions. I want to know more. That would be one of the leading indicators for me, is really that curiosity, and that takes vulnerability. So, again, with the time piece, you need some time to build up trust where people can ask those questions and, not feel like they're going to be judged for it, and instead feel like they're going to be supported with their curiosity.
I love talking about essentially curiosity and humility there, right? We're talking about how important it is to remain curious about the data, and also presumably to let the data ask us questions too, to challenge our thinking. And also you've alluded to this idea of humility, right? That we don't know everything, but also the data doesn't know everything. And therefore we're all in this process of discovery and kind of co-learning. Does that marry with how you'd like to see data culture develop, Saleem?
Yeah, absolutely. And when Paul asked the original question, there were a couple of things that came to mind of sort of like, what would I go back and tell myself? I agree with Beth, taking it slowly, trying to understand where your team is. And what I have flashbacks about sometimes is my very, very first day as a principal in the States. We did a data walk and we put our previous year's state testing scores up on the wall. In some areas we did okay. In writing in particular, we had not done well. And that's a test that they take in fourth grade. And I wanted the whole community to look at it and say, hey, we're really struggling in this area. What can we do? What can you do as a kindergarten teacher? What can we do as a third grade teacher in order to help our kids get ready for this test, this high stakes test that they're going to take at fourth grade? I thought the session went well. We had a lot of ideas that came out of it. And then 6 months later, I'm sitting one-on-one with a teacher, and she was like, I cannot believe you put my data up on those. So fourth grade teacher, I cannot believe you put the data up on the wall like that. People are judging me. People are saying things. And I was like, I thought that was a great session. But it was really personal to her. Of like, you did that to me, you embarrassed me in front of the entire staff on the first day of school, and I'm still mad at you about this 6 months later, and I never told you about it. But, and I was like, oh, like, I get it. We're not all in the same place. We're not all thinking the same about this data. We're not all interpreting what it means the same. And for many, many people, especially early in the process, data is really, really personal. And so as I look for the shift, I hope to see, like, I want our staff, our teachers to take the data seriously. I want them to try and understand what it's telling us, but I don't want them to take it personally. I want them to have that sort of efficacy that, like, I can change this, I can work on this, we can develop this as a team, that we can impact this data, but not that data that isn't what we wanted. It means I'm a failure as a teacher, as a person. Like, that's not at all what we want, and that's certainly what I contributed to in that first situation. I guess the second thing, and this also comes from my time in the States, is I feel like the data that we collect and the actions that we take should be aligned to our mission and our vision, who we say we're going to be as a school, who we want to be, to our values. And I feel like that wasn't always the case in the States, and sometimes we miss here as well. And when I say, like, if we have a vision that talks about, nurturing the whole child and really developing empathy and things like that, we cannot respond to data by taking away things that develop the whole child. And that's really what happened in the States. These kids are not performing where we want to on this reading test. They're not going to get recess for the next 6 weeks. And we're going to use that recess time for intensive intervention. And they need to come in on Saturdays. And we can't do inquiry in the classroom anymore. We just don't have time for that. All of it's going to be direct instruction. And we're going to have test prep as a major component of each of our courses, because what's important here is moving the data. And if you are aligned with your mission and your vision and saying, this is important, we're developing our whole child, you can look at the data and see that you have needs, but you compare to your mission and say, okay, what do we do? What do we need to do that's in line with who we want to be as a school and who we want our students to grow up to be, that's going to have a positive impact on our students and their academic success, as well as their development as people.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
I think there are a couple of really profound things going on there in your response, Saleem. The second of which was, if we talk in our guiding statements about the whole child, but we only measure part of the child, then there's something really awry there, which is going to lead to lots of the data problems we've seen perpetuated over the decades, right? But the other thing that really resonated with me was where you talked about almost depersonalizing the data. And you talked about how, as a teacher, my data is not me, right? The data on my classes is not data about me as a human being. And yet, as a teacher, you can take that really personally. But isn't it also the case for students, right? Some of the most kind of intransigent and deeply rooted well-being issues we have for kids in schools around the world is because they see their grades, and they see their grades as a reflection of them. And so that separation of performance and person seems to matter both at a teacher level and a student level. Do you think there's some truth in that? And how do we protect against it?
Absolutely. I think there's a ton of truth to that. And it's challenging. In a lot of ways, it's a mindset, and we're trying to adjust that mindset here is to move to standards-based grading, and move away from these percentage scores or these grades that just tell me how I am as a math learner, how I am as a reader, and move into deeper understanding of where I currently am as a learner and what I need to do next to improve. And so how do we look at this data that I have on this essay that I just wrote as a data point that tells me where I am currently in development? And so we're really working on rubrics with our teachers and student developed rubrics as well, of like really understanding that, yep, everybody's growing, everybody's in different places, and this is where I am right now. It doesn't limit me or doesn't say that this is all I will ever be, but it does give me a good glimpse of where I am right now and hopefully spark some conversations. And I think we've said this a number of times, but I'm going to say it again, just like data should be driving us to ask questions. It should be driving us to dig deeper. And for me, that helps a lot when you're doing that as a group and not doing that individually. And so if students and parents and teachers are coming together and looking at current levels of performance and what could be the next step for this child in their growth, to me, that's a really important piece of kids really understanding that a grade doesn't define who they are. And I think a side benefit of that is as you start doing that work with your students, as you start doing that work with parents, teachers start to feel that a little bit as well. And we have a lot of teachers who come from more traditional grading practices who are now starting to see, oh, okay, we can look at data in very different ways. We can have different conversations about it. And hopefully that opens them up to having those sorts of conversations about the data they're getting back about their own teaching and learning as well. I think that's really important. It's a process that we're going through, as I mentioned before, right now, of students giving teachers honest, kind, and specific feedback about what's going on in their classes. And then I sit down with them and I talk with them about what we're learning from this data and what we want to continue, and if there are any changes that we might want to make based on the voices that we're hearing.
There's three really interesting ideas in that seem like they're clustered together. And it's I guess I'm finding it interesting because I'd never clustered them quite as closely as they are in this conversation. One of them is the collective self-efficacy. The second is this idea of depersonalizing the data. And then the third one is the idea of growth mindset versus more of like a fixed mindset. And the overall picture that you're describing is like, as we start to think of the data and the feedback that we're getting as something that is under our control and can show, if we do this, then it will show that. It's not something done to us, but we have that efficacy, then that allows us to grow. And it's not necessarily tied to some sort of fixed idea of who we are as a person. I have a question. Saleem, you were talking about some of the dangers about where the data that we're looking at is misaligned with the vision of that whole child and the things we really value. What would it look like if it was aligned? Like if you were in a school where the data was tightly aligned with that vision of the child, and so working to improve the data was improving that overall vision and alignment, what would be some of the signs that that was the case?
Yeah, it's funny. You guys, we didn't get to my answer for one of your previous questions was like, where does the data fall short? And my answer to that was like, the data doesn't fall short. I fall short. Like, I feel like I just don't have the time to process, to communicate, to everything, all of the data that's out there, because there's so much data. In a world where the data that we collect, reflect on, respond to is tightly aligned to our mission and our values, then we can cut out some of the noise. We can really focus in on those things that are important. And we can structure our leadership team meetings, our student reflection meetings, our parent meetings on the data that we have decided as a community is the most important. And we can celebrate that. We have a lot of celebrations at this school. We have a lot of celebrations. They're not always aligned to what we say we value. And so we spend a lot of time and energy and effort on a lot of different things. And to me, to answer your question, we could really tighten some of that up and make sure that we are focusing on impacting, celebrating in a continual process, those things that we feel are most important as a community. And in that way, almost strengthen the community because we are coming together around these central things that we say are important rather than having so many different, it's kind of like when you have too many priorities, you have no priorities, right? I kind of think that's where we are with data. Oftentimes we have so much data that we can't find those priorities and impact those priorities. And when you are able to use your guiding documents to define, where we're going to spend our time, where we're going to spend our energy, where are we going to spend our effort, and what do we really value as a community, then I think the community only gets stronger through that.
What about you, Beth? What would that really unified school look like? Because Saleem's talking about, I suppose you mentioned the many priorities and one priority. Stephen Covey used to say the main thing is to keep the main thing, right? What would it look like if we did actually keep our main thing the main thing in relation to our assessment, our data, and our core values and vision and mission?
I mean, the thought that kept coming to mind for me as Saleem was sharing was like ruthless prioritization of a lot of really hard conversations, a lot of debates, navigating through conflict with different perspectives on what is the main priority. I thought back to an example of, I was a principal of a dual language school. In our first 2 years, we were very clear on we needed and to measure our students' listening and speaking proficiency in both languages, English and Spanish. That drove what our classrooms look like. It drove our teacher perspective. And then as the state test started, this was in the US, we dropped doing that for all grade levels. And even now in reflecting, I'm like, man, that was a really big mistake. That was at the core of what our school was. And in order to keep prioritizing that would have been some really, really hard decisions about what to drop. So I don't know, like in hearing the conversation, the thing that just kept coming to mind for me of like, these are really hard conversations. There's competing perspectives, competing viewpoints, and making a call at the end of the day after hearing various voices and having a process for that keeps whatever data you're collecting most aligned. I think that's a process that sometimes we think about takes time, but I also think it takes perseverance. You need to have stamina and energy to keep that conversation going. And to keep having the tough conversations, when it might be easier to be like, yep, we'll do what everybody else does. We'll prioritize what every other school does, and to make different decisions. I don't know, it takes courage too.
what it made me think is that data leadership in schools then is not about data science. It's a vision and values piece, right? And we're leading data in schools. We're leading vision and values far more than we are leading analytics platforms and visualizations and spreadsheets and data collection, all of that. We have to have the two really fused if we're to reach those future schools that you guys are talking about there.
Definitely.
I just wonder, we end up talking a lot in general terms in these conversations. In general, schools should do this. In general, schools have done that. This is what policy we've followed. This is what practice we've adopted. I'm wondering if you can just share with us, if you've got one to hand, an individual story of a child whose future has changed in part as a result of a different approach to their data. Can you think of any examples of a student like that? If we're talking ultimately about, we talked about impact, we talked about shifts, we talked about student growth. Is there a student you can think of whose trajectory was different as a result of a better, deeper, more curious, more humble use of data?
There's an example that I have from my early teaching experience. This little girl named Marlene, who I was trying to teach to read. She was a second grader and just really, really struggled with working memory. And I had just gone to a training that taught me all how I'm going to work with these kids who struggle with me in dyslexia training. And so I had all of my data, like this is what I need to collect. And she needs to know her letters and she needs to know her sounds. And so once she gets to this many letters and this many sounds, then I can teach her to read. And she struggled. I mean, she really, really struggled to the point where we were on the letter B and I could pick up a B and show her the B, have her say B. I'd put it down and I'd pick it immediately right back up and say, what letter is this? And she would look at me like she had never seen it before. And I had never seen anything like it. And I was ill prepared to deal with anything like this in my second year of teaching. And this program, which was a fantastic program, taught me what I needed to do and taught me, like, this is the data you collect. And this is how you'll know when she's ready for that next thing. And other kids in the group were flying. They were picking it up and they were going. And so they ended up in a different group and it was just me and her. And we're doing this work and she's looking over at them. And she's like, Mr. Blevins, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to read. They're reading. Why can't I read? And I was like, well, your data says you're not ready to read. And she was like, I'm ready. I want to do this. And so I, at the time, made this choice of like, okay, we're going to do this because it's something that you want. And we're going to keep doing these things that we're doing. And it was absolutely amazing. It was something that she wanted to do. And she started to read and she was doing all the same work that the other kids were doing, blending these sounds together. She doesn't even know the names of these letters. She can't recall the names, but through this multisensory technique that we were using, she was able to connect the sounds and she was able to put them together and she was able to read. And that for me just told me that my scope of data was too limited. And when you're not listening to kids' voice and don't have kid buy-in and motivation to do that, like, you're missing out. And so that has been a big part for me at every stage from now on. Yes, we're collecting data. Yes, we're looking at academics. Yes, we're looking at progress and growth. But we also have to hear from the kids directly. And they're going to tell us things that we're not going to expect, that at times we're not going to believe. But they're going to surprise us with their maturity, with their knowledge of themselves. Nobody knows them better than they know themselves. And so when you're missing the voice from the most important stakeholder, you're really missing out. And so that's why that was something that has just taught me, like, yeah, we have to find ways to hear directly from kids. And so for me, it's completely changed my style. We talk about an open door, but like, kids really, at this point, I have sixth graders coming up to me in the hallway because they feel comfortable. They know that Mr. Blevins cares about my school experience. And if the bathroom is dirty, I'm going to go and tell Mr. Blevins the bathroom is dirty. And if we don't have enough balls at recess, I'm going to tell him because he's going to do something about it. He listens to us. He understands that our experience here is important, and we can go directly to him if we have any issues. Now, that's not the only way, and I would be spending all day, every day just listening to kid complaints if that was it. But like, how are we spending our time collecting that voice, those important voices? So I know that was a long story. I apologize for that, but it's one that really has impacted how I see my role as an educator.
I think that that's a great place to end this conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. Really enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, thank you both of you.
This
It's been
was
amazing.
fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.